Hello there and welcome back to this video series on personality. This particular video is going to do a quick recap on some of the things that we've covered so far, such as the big 5 personality traits, and if you haven't seen any of those and you're interested in exploring personality as a whole or on the individual trait level, then definitely check out some of those videos. But in this video, we're going to touch on a few little details that we didn't cover previously, such as can you manually change your personality? Does it naturally change over time? And what are the main personality differences between men and women? So let's jump straight into it. So starting with the obvious refresher, personality is made up of 5 distinct traits, which are extroversion, neuroticism, agreeableness, openness, and conscientiousness. Now, each of these traits is a spectrum, which means if you do a personality test, you'll be given a percentile score for each one of them, and this just corresponds to where you are relative to everyone else. So for example, if you end up in the 50th percentile, that just means you are completely average in that trait. It is worth mentioning again that each of these traits are 50% genetically influenced, which means that no matter where you fall on those traits, 50% of that is outside of your control. But it does mean that the remaining 50% is within your control, or at least it's determined based on your environment and your exposure. For example, if you find that you're very introverted or very high in neuroticism, it's likely due to a combination of genetic influence, but also your environment and your situation. So if you end up in a high stress environment involving lots of people, then you could find that this is negatively affecting your score. So obviously there is some leeway in terms of how you can change over time based on that environment, but also it does require some active changes in order to get there, and this isn't something that typically happens overnight. It's important to realize that personality alone doesn't tell you absolutely everything about you, and in many ways, if you want to understand what exactly makes you unique and function in the real world, then it's best to look at things at 3 separate layers or 3 separate levels. The first level is the big 5 personality traits, which as I mentioned previously is 50% genetically influenced. But the next layer is character behavioral patterns. And this is something like if you imagine 2 people with high extroversion, they're not exactly going to be the same person. So one person might be extremely sociable and end up being a public speaker for a living, whereas someone else might end up being a skydiver. They're influenced by the same underlying emotion and positive emotions of extroversion, but they end up doing 2 very different things overall. The last layer is your personal life story. So this is the story that a person tells themselves about who they are, what they're doing, and why they're doing it. This is important because if one person doesn't have a clear or strong opinion of themselves, what they're trying to do, and another person does, they know exactly who they want to be and why they want to be it, then you will see a huge difference between how these 2 different people approach life, even though they might share a lot of similar personality traits and even similar interests. So if you have the goal of changing your life circumstances, it might not be as simple as trying to change your underlying personality traits. It could be simply the story you tell yourself about yourself is the underlying problem. And this requires a different type of approach, and we'll get into this later in the video. But first I want to discuss how your personality changes as you age. So the 2 traits that tend to increase as you get older are agreeableness and conscientiousness. And this is just a side effect of feeling more connected, having more relationships, having stronger relationships, but also feeling a stronger preference towards order, rather than the traits that come along with exploration and even chaos that tends to be the case when you're younger, when you don't know much about the world and you're trying to find your place in it. Therefore, it's probably not too surprising that the 3 traits that tend to decline or decrease when you get older are extroversion, openness, and neuroticism. And this is for a combination of reasons, but ultimately, as you become more established in the world, there is less reason for openness, which is more about exploration, breaking boundaries, and pushing out and trying to discover new things. And the same is true with neuroticism. As you become more and more certain in terms of how the world works, then there's less uncertainty and there's less reason to feel anxious or distressed. I'm going to segue a little bit into high neuroticism, as this is the trait that most people who have it are least proud of and the one that they're actively trying to change. The problem with high neuroticism is that generally speaking, it seems that more bad things seem to happen to people with this trait, or at least it's perceived that way. And this is true on the micro level and the macro level. So on a micro level, it seems like more negative events seems to affect that individual, but at the same time, the more chronic and long-term issues seem to be affecting this person as well, such as depression and anxiety. Now, this is partly due to the fact that people with high neuroticism are more sensitive to negative events and negative emotion. So it's not necessarily that things objectively are worse, but it definitely feels that way to people with this trait. But arguably even more important than this is that people with high neuroticism tend to struggle to tell positive stories about themselves. They see themselves more negatively, and therefore this negative viewpoint and impression about themselves tends to actually manifest in ways that are more self-destructive. It often takes years of hard work and going through processes and support systems such as cognitive behavioral therapy for them to overcome their negative image and to overcome the things that have been holding them back throughout their lives. In addition, if having high neuroticism essentially means that you have a lower threshold for negative events and negative triggers, then it becomes even more important to find healthy outlets and ways of dealing with these negative feelings, such as exercise, yoga, and meditation. Now we're going to move on to some of the general differences in personality between men and women, and the traits that are most common in terms of the differences are agreeableness and neuroticism. And on average, women tend to be more agreeable and more neurotic, and in many ways this is explained by a woman's innate maternal instincts. The highest difference between men and women is in compassion, with women scoring higher than men. But in order of highest differences, women also score higher than men in withdrawal, politeness, volatility, openness, orderliness, and enthusiasm, whereas men score more highly in assertiveness than women on average. An important point to realize is that there is more personality diversity within men and women than there is between them. The same is true when it comes to race and ethnicity. This means that diversity is not to be found in group identity. Rather, diversity is found in individual differences in personality. If you've seen any of my older videos on personality, such as the one on the color model, then you'll see that this is also reflected there, as the most successful organizations and businesses tend to be the ones that strike a good balance between different personality types. Having a balance between creative, conscientious, and agreeable people can create a stable environment, but also one where people with different strengths can shine. An important thing to realize is that when you compare any two groups when it comes to personality, is that even though the differences might not seem that big at the start, such as the ones between men and women, what it really comes down to is these really become more extreme in the extremes. So even though the average guy and the average girl might not differ that much in any one of the traits, but when it comes to the extremes, it tends to favor one group disproportionately more than the other. So like I said, the average differences between the average guy and girl isn't that big, but when it comes to high agreeableness, nearly all of the most agreeable people are women, and nearly all of the least agreeable people are men. This is why there are far more men in prisons than there are women. It's not because that the average guy is more prone to criminality than the average girl, but the people who are most prone to criminality are the people who are least agreeable, and like I said, these tend to be men. An interesting note on criminality is that there's also some correlation with creativity, and this makes sense when you look at the trait openness, and what openness tends to be is how much you like to push boundaries and explore territory that you're not yet familiar with. And when you think of what a criminal might like to do is to break boundaries, and one of those boundaries might be the law, but it's certainly to think outside the box and use your creative strengths to do something that you wouldn't typically do, or something that a typical person might not do. This is also why if you look at some of the most dangerous people out there and the most violent people, as they age, they drop in openness, they increase in orderliness, and this is partly due to the personality differences and partly due to the decrease in testosterone that you get when you age. So to summarize, there is a correlation between creativity and criminality, but it doesn't mean that just because you're creative that you're naturally going to become more prone to be a criminal. It's just that criminals tend to have a little bit of creativity in them, and this is partly because of the trait openness, which again is about pushing boundaries. And there's also a few things that tends to be quite interesting observations when it comes to openness, and that is people with higher openness tend to have more tattoos and piercings too, as this is a way again of defying convention, breaking outside the rules of expectation and the way of expressing themselves in an artistic way. But again, a small portion of people with this trait might manifest it in the direction of criminality, but this isn't going to be the case for the vast majority of people. The last side effect that I want to mention, based on the personality changes that occur when you age, is that because your openness tends to decline and your conscientiousness tends to go up, what this actually translates to on a political level is that you tend to become more conservative as you age. And that's why the vast majority of liberal activists tend to be younger, but once they've become more established in the world and they've obtained things that they want to now protect, they tend to become slightly more conservative, because what conservatism ultimately is trying to hold on to the things that have got us to where we are now, as opposed to becoming more liberal or progressive, which is all about trying to create change in society. Anyway, I hope you've enjoyed this video and the series overall. Feel free to rewatch or revisit any of those videos, and I'm going to go into other videos around personality in the future, but it won't be part of this one. I'm going to go into things such as psychopathy, what makes a psychopath, and how to identify one, particularly based on things such as personality. So if you're interested in videos like that, I'd really appreciate if you could like and subscribe, or even leave down some feedback in the comment section. Otherwise, I'll see you in the next video.